Now, we are making now a discussion, and we would like to ask Alfred, Alan, Thomas, and Deputy Mayor of Amsterdam to come out. And we will have 5 questions. We don't have too much time. We could talk endlessly about these questions. So I will try to be a very, very strict moderator. So please come out. I will stay here, probably. My aim is to have a brainstorming. We will not find solutions. We will not leave this room knowing what are the best solutions, but at least we will have some ideas how things can be better, can be made better. And here are the 5 questions, and we will do them one by one. The first is about decision making, then we will talk about planning competencies, about functions, and these are the 3 which I would do in any case under the time what we have. And then we can talk about revenues and about partnership building. Now, the first question is about decision making. So we have now 4 examples here. We have Amsterdam, Stuttgart, Manchester, and Barcelona, and we roughly know about how decisions are made. In some case, it is direct, in some other case, not. At the beginning of this discussion, I would like to give a few minutes to all the 3 case study cities representatives to tell their views about the study. So maybe we can start with Amsterdam, if you don't mind. So you have now roughly 3 or 4 minutes or 5 just to tell about. There's a microphone there, yes. You have a presentation as well. Okay, where is it?
On the computer.
Okay.
Yes, you want me to sit here, sir, or stand over there? How would you like?
It's up to you.
Yeah. Okay, then I'll stay here, and maybe Dagmar, you can skip the slides for me. Does it work? Yes? Okay. Okay. Yes, this slide. Why don't I stand over there so I can see my own slides? Let's see if that works. No. Thank you very much. I'm going to take this off for a moment. And then when the question comes, I'll put it on. So let's see if this works. I will use this mic for now. We're all set. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you for the invitation. Thank you for commissioning the study. My name is Udo Koch. I'm the Deputy Mayor for Finance and Economic Affairs in the City of Amsterdam. The report is very wide-ranging, so it's not possible to reflect on every single aspect of it. So I would like to focus on one primary aspect. If you can skip to the next slide, because that's, no, the previous one. Yeah, that one. Which is the way regional cooperation is organized in Amsterdam. And if you're cynical, you could say it's not organized at all. But if you're not cynical, you could say, well, it's a very flexible and open system. This is what the metro region looks like. It's a region with Amsterdam as the main city, 850,000 inhabitants, and then the region has 2.5 million people, 1.5 million jobs, about 1.2 million residential dwellings. The thing is, it is from a bureaucratic and political point of view, it's an extremely complex region. There are more than 30 municipalities, which is not unusual for a large metropolitan area. But it also has 2 provinces, which really in a way is 4, because it's not just the 2 that you see mentioned there, but also the province South Holland, which has a lot of issues with the airport Schiphol, and then there's Utrecht. Let me give you one illustration of how complex this bureaucratic structure is. My colleague, Pieter Litjens, my previous colleague who dealt with public transport issues, he had to deal with 6 different bureaucratic levels. He was a deputy mayor for public transportation. 6 different bureaucratic levels to manage public transportation. One level was the boroughs, which are the sub-municipality levels, the boroughs, the neighborhoods. And they have elected officials. Then there's the city of Amsterdam, obviously. Then there is the metropolitan region, which is not really a bureaucratic or a political construct, but it does have responsibilities and competencies. Then there is what we call the transportation region, which is actually a bureaucratic construct that is primarily intended to redistribute funds from the state government to the local government. It's like a metropolitan region for transportation issues only. So that's 4, I think. Yeah, we're at 4. Then we have the provinces. They deal with roads and planning issues. And then there's the national government. Obviously, we have a national government in the Netherlands. And of course, there's Brussels, where you have to deal with regulatory issues and funding. So that's an extremely complex situation. It's very difficult to manage. So one of the questions that was raised in the report is, should you institutionalize these metropolitan regions like Barcelona has done or Manchester has done? And my view is only if you abolish one of the other levels, because otherwise it's going to get way too complex. And since it is very unlikely and almost maybe even unfair to ask politicians, because all of these levels are politicians, I'm a politician, to abolish their own job. So that's not going to happen. None of these, Brussels, which by the way I think is very useful, I think the EU is very useful, it's not going to be abolished. The boroughs are not going to abolish themselves. The city of Amsterdam has been there for 741 years. We're not going to abolish ourselves. So none of these levels will be abolished. The provinces, I think it's questionable exactly what they add to the whole construct, but they're not going to abolish themselves. So since nothing will be abolished, I think it's not a good idea to add another official layer. So we should stick, at least in Amsterdam, with this informal structure, this informal way of cooperation, and maybe later in the debate I can talk a little bit more about that and explain how that works in Amsterdam. This is the main point I wanted to make about the study. Again, thanks for commissioning it, and thanks for the invitation. I look forward to a good debate. Thanks.
Okay. I'm not sure if my mic is working. Can everybody hear me? Yes. We're rolling. Okay. I want to make a few brief points from a Greater Manchester perspective on what I think is a very good report from Ivan and his colleagues. But I want to start by welcoming the spirit of today's occasion. You will all know that the UK had a referendum last year, and it's created a few difficulties for us, it has to be said. Certainly from a Greater Manchester perspective, the idea of having collaborative relationships between cities in Europe actually becomes more important than less important, given the current issues that we face, and we're beginning to see that where the UK has led, some of Europe is thinking of following. I wouldn't recommend that path, but I think inter-city collaboration at the European level is going to be increasingly important to all of our futures. That having been said, what Ivan sets out in his report is 2 models of metropolitan governance. One, more informal, flexible geographies, collaborative relationships, absence of firm institutions. and then something else, which is where Manchester, Greater Manchester, has ended up recently, which is a fixed administrative authority with a growing number of competencies, and, as I will say in a second, a directly elected mayor who I think does make a substantial difference. The message I want to get over to you is that it is possible to move between those two points. And there are certain things in the history of change in Greater Manchester which gives you an indication of how that is possible. The first one is just a bit of a warning that building metropolitan relationships and institutions and structures, certainly in our case, has taken a lot of time. So I go back to Udo's comment about it being difficult to abolish tiers of government. We don't find it that difficult in the UK. So we did have a short-lived experiment with metropolitan government, a second tier, above the level of the municipalities for precisely 12 years between 1974 and 1986. All of those authorities, there were 7 of them, were abolished by Margaret Thatcher's UK governments in the 1980s. What has happened in Greater Manchester, uniquely in the UK, is that what started off as voluntary relationships which continue to run some joint services between those 10 authorities have grown over time to the point now where we've effectively recreated the thing which was abolished 30 years ago. So abolition is possible in highly centralised contexts like the UK. Time is the first point I want to make. Geography is also very important. We are lucky in some senses that Greater Manchester continues to have a relatively concentrated high level of economic activity at the very centre of the conurbation. It doesn't lie within any one administrative district, but the particularly higher level employment in the service sector is dominated by the centre of the conurbation. And because that encourages relationships, trading relationships, commuting relationships with a whole panoply of districts outside of that centre. There has always been a sense within Greater Manchester that the districts are in this together, as we say. An automatic presumption in favour of collaborative relationships, if you like. I think that differs. So we've seen illustrations of Barcelona and Amsterdam so far this morning. The geography of the economy obviously differs in different places. The more important thing, I think, is that there is some level of collaborative understanding about what that geography is. So you don't have to have a monocentric metropolitan area to be able to tell a story about how the areas interrelate. But you do need that narrative if you're going to be able to persuade each of the participants to stay with a metropolitan rather than a district-focused set of strategies and instruments. So Greater Manchester has worked very, very hard at the evidence which underpins the analysis of the way in which the place operates. Crises help. I've already mentioned the abolition of the county, the rapid deindustrialisation of the city in particular, and the city region created a sense of crisis that people within the conurbation felt they had to respond to. Unfortunately, we have had 2 major bombings in the centre of the city of Manchester. One, as you probably know, quite recently. About 4.5 weeks into the mayor's term of office was the atrocity at the arena at a pop concert. 20 years previous to that, we had a major IRA bomb exploded in the centre of the city. None of us would have wanted those things to happen, but the fact is that it does bring people together in a way that you can see that collaborative relations ratcheting up after those things happened. Let me close with the importance of direct election of a mayor. I think in Greater Manchester's case, because it builds on that 30-year history of collaboration and the development of institutional structures, it's taken us to a different level. But it's done so for very particular reasons, I think. So, and that's got to do with the individual involved. So, if my mayor was sat here today, he would be relatively modest about this. He would say, because I am the one politician who has to represent all of Greater Manchester, it is incumbent upon me to try and find consensual ways forward on all of the major issues that the city regions face. So it's because I cover the whole territory that I am able to operate more effectively than any single council leader could. I can say this because I'm not the mayor. It's also got to do with the character of the individual. So what we have got happening in the UK now, within England at least, is that the idea of being a metropolitan mayor is becoming more politically attractive to higher quality candidates. So our mayor was what we call a Secretary of State, was a minister in national governments. In Labour governments towards the end of that party's term in office. He was a shadow minister when the Labour Party went into opposition in 2010. He has taken a bold decision, and he's not on his own, to vacate national politics and to see metropolitan politics as increasingly important. That connects, I think, the fact that we've got a change in Manchester with my initial comments. We see the metropolitan area within a much bigger context, not just a UK one, as being absolutely critical. So I would bear out much of what Ivan said on that. That'll do for now.
Just to clarify, what is the size of Manchester? How many people?
The city?
Yeah.
The city is just over 500,000 people.
And Greater Manchester, 2.5?
The metropolitan area is getting up towards 2 million, 1.7, 1.8 million.
Okay, so the size of the central city and the metropolitan area is important because if the central city is 2/3 of the metropolitan area, then a directly elected mayor has a different dimension if it is only 1/5 or 1/4. So in Manchester, it was probably easier to get accepted a directly elected mayor, and the mayor of Manchester was not so much worried, probably.
How long have you got?
Yes, okay, but good.
So the decision to move towards a directly elected metropolitan mayor was partly a result of a dialogue between national and local government. So for many years, Greater Manchester was effectively governed by a coalition of the 10 leaders of Greater Manchester who shared metropolitan responsibilities between them. If we're honest about it, I think those 10 leaders would have been perfectly happy to carry on with that system, had it not been the case that central government said, if we're going to have devolution of functions, we need a system of governance which makes accountability perfectly clear. And their preferred model was a directly elected metropolitan mayor. Greater Manchester acquiesced to that idea. It's because of that dialogue that we have a directly elected
But not
mayor.
all areas in England accepted this offer by the government.
Absolutely. Yeah? It was easier for Manchester to make that step than it is for other metropolitan areas because they don't have that history. Okay.
Now let's come to Stuttgart. How it came that you have a directly elected regional parliament, which is almost a unique model in Europe?
Good morning, everybody. I hope I can explain this. Let me start with a few figures. There are 2.7 million people are living in Stuttgart region, and in Stuttgart, almost only a quarter of them. So Stuttgart has 600,000 inhabitants roughly. So there is a total different and polycentric approach than you can find here in Barcelona. We have a very strong GDP. The GDP of Stuttgart region is like the same size if you take the 3 Baltic countries, Estonia, Lithuania and Latvia together, but it's on a much smaller patch of land. And we are not so much industry that is coined by service or research and other activities. We are building cars. So when we are talking about economic development, we are talking about factories and plants. You heard the names Daimler, Porsche, or Bosch, for example. These are our main manufacturers with many suppliers within the chain.
No connection.
No connection?
No connection.
Okay. What a pity. And we have 50,000 jobs alone in building combustion engines. Diesel, all those things that are blamed for the pollution. And you can imagine that if you are totally depending on car manufacturing, and you can see your technology and your knowledge is phasing out because we are shifting to economic or electric cars, that we have some uncertainties in the future. And we really have to make sure that we are prepared for that change, especially in spatial terms, but also in terms of workforce and all things that connected with that. But right now we are a totally economic powerhouse. There are 30% of the GDP and 50% of the tax revenue of the land of Baden-Württemberg are earned in Stuttgart region alone on 10% of the land surface of the land. So there is a high concentration of population and of economic power. In administrative terms, this powerhouse is totally fractured among 179 municipalities. So that's the administrative situation you can find. You have one position that works closely together, people are commuting, supply chains are totally independent from local responsibilities, but there is a strong local level distributed among 179 municipalities, and municipalities in Germany are strong. Even when they are small, 2/3 of this number have less than 10,000 inhabitants. In fact, we are not talking about cities, we are talking about villages or even very small hamlets. Nevertheless, they are strong. The mayors are very strong leaders. They are the leader of the local councils. They are directly elected, and they are also responsible for everything that happens in City Hall. So there is a very, very strong position on local level. And the municipalities are, of course, in charge for doing all the land use planning, all the zoning. So there is always a strong debate how houses should be built and where they should be built on a local level. But as 75% of the workforce have to commute from one place to another, it becomes clear that there must be some strong coordination on a supra-municipality level. And that was the primary role of the Verband Region Stuttgart. We have been in charge for a strong regional planning that coordinates the land use and the development on local level. And of course, if you have strong mandatory guidelines on a regional level, and you are well known for enforcing them consequently, we even filed lawsuits against some municipalities, you are not the best friend of the mayors. So that's what happened. But these things aside, what became clear in the crisis of the early 1990s was that planning and enforced plans is not enough if you want to stay competitive and if you want to have a sustainable development. So under the impression of the crisis in the mid-90s, there was a strong political commitment that there have to be more competences shifted to the regional level. We brought up some competences for economic development, but also some competences have been shifted down from the federal state to the regional level. So we ended up with being no longer just responsible for regional planning. We became the competence for main parts of the public transport infrastructure. This is kind of logical consequence if you have commuters in a certain area, that you have someone who is in charge for organizing the commute on a level above the municipalities. So what we are doing now is we are managing and building the metro system. We have some extensions going right on right now together with the Stuttgart 21 project. We are responsible for an express bus system throughout the region, and most recently we have become responsible also for the management of park and ride facilities and the coordination of park and ride facilities, and also for the installation of a regional institution that should manage the traffic flow throughout the region. Now it's just one established in Stuttgart. We lift this traffic coordination institution now to a more regional level. We are also responsible for, we call it the green infrastructure. This is the active development of landscape and open spaces. We see this as a major contribution to improve the overall living quality in Stuttgart region. We depend on people that move to Stuttgart region, so to stay competitive. We also want to improve the recreation quality, the leisure quality. We want to make sure that we are adapted to climate change. So to have an instrument that allows us actively improve the open space quality is a very important part for regional development. We're also responsible for the economic development. So we have a branch office that promotes the region on the huge fairs, the MIPIM in Cannes or the Expo Real in Munich. And despite all debates on what should be shifted to the regional level, every single mayor would really agree on that it's much better if you want to be seen on a global scale as a place for investment, as a place for development. It's much better if you come up with one huge institution compared to if you have 179 municipalities trying to be seen on a global scale. We also have a very active cluster policy. We're doing some equipment activities. We support innovation, research and development, especially also in terms of mobility. So then there's also an office that deals with regional marketing. So in a nutshell, the Verband Region Stuttgart is responsible for really binding and mandatory planning. We provide parts of the key infrastructure in open spaces and mobility, and we have, if you want to call it like that, a propaganda instrument for economic development and marketing. So when you have the three fields of activity in mind, it becomes clear that there are some decisions that have to be made that are very essential for the questions, how do we want to live in Stuttgart region? And if you consider that it is quite normal that you have in the local councils a debate of if you should a new house this way or that way, that it is much more important, that it's much more political debate necessary if you talk about the questions where to build new parts of towns, where have new residential areas, where have new commercial sites. And that's what we are doing in the regional parliament. It is directly elected, as Ivan already mentioned. So we have key questions discussed in a political scale on a regional level. And the idea to add that, and that's the huge difference, and I'm coming to your question here, the huge difference between having someone delegated from a county or someone directly elected for a regional level is that whoever wants to be elected has to come up with political ideas what he wants to achieve on a regional level. And after 5 years, he has to tell the people what he has achieved in the last 5 years if he wants to be elected again. So what we have in Stuttgart with the directly elected regional assembly is in fact that we made the region a level of political action taking. And this is, I think, consequent because the region is in fact the area where people move on an everyday basis. They're going from their town of residence to the town where they work. They go to Stuttgart for cultural events. They go to other places for education, for spend their leisure time. So I think making this a political discussion and a political decision making is quite essential. Thank you very much.
Stuttgart is probably a famous example. Why don't you have other parts of Germany which follow this model?
I think that's an easy question, because if you want to shift competences, you need a strong impact and you need huge political majorities. And we had the very, very seldom constellation in the 90s that we had a crisis, and everybody could see obviously that we need some change. And at the very same time, we had the very rare situation that we had a huge majority in the federal state parliament. So at this time, the Social Democrats and the Conservatives teamed up. They had a majority far beyond 70%. If you look at the situation now, we hardly find a coalition that really has more than 55%, and you have 3 or 4 parties involved. And we do lack a crisis, so that there is no need for change, and as we heard, there is no such thing that you have a change by itself. You need a special constellation.
Okay, so if I summarize the cases, we have a case, Amsterdam, there is no elected leadership. We have Manchester, which just changed to a directly elected president. We have Stuttgart, where financial crisis in 1994 and political constellation has led to a directly elected leadership. So what is the position in Barcelona? How do you think about this option at all? Because there are many options here. One is not having any directly elected leader, having only the leader directly elected, having an indirect election of the delegated people, or trying to go to the Stuttgart model.
Yeah, well, first of all, let me say that the report which you directed is a brilliant report. It's very stimulating. It helps us a lot, and it enables us to hold this debate. So it was commissioned because of that. Let me also say that it doesn't necessarily represent the official position of Metropolitan Barcelona, as you know. But I think we have to say it. We have to clarify that. We are talking all the time about visibility. Should the metropolitan area be more visible? Apart from having more powers, apart from helping people in their daily lives and daily needs. Right here, we're also talking about, is it positive that metropolitan areas should have a stronger identity, should have elected officials, and should be on the focus. And that means political focus and media focus, right? And I think that's a very relevant point. And we have different answers to that. And probably if we meet again in 50 years' time, we'll be still young and strong, we will probably have different positions from the ones we have right now, ourselves. So this is a shifting kind of scenario, and we also shift with the environment. So in the case of Barcelona, we had a very, very long discussion, and it's not solved. We don't have a final answer to that, about whether the metropolitan area should be more visible. Because there's strong points and arguments to sustain that, yes, it should, and also strong arguments to sustain that it shouldn't. No? Let me go to the second ones. And historically, we've been debating about this. We even had some major fights, political fights about this. Why do many people think that it should not be more visible? Well, basically because there's a reality which is the Catalan reality, which you mentioned, and which makes it difficult to fit in one and the other. There's people who would say that if you create a big metropolitan area put like 4.5 million inhabitants, that could be done. I mean, the real city could correspond with something like that. But then how does that fit in with a government, a Catalan government, which rules over 7.5 million? It's not that easy, and it creates, just thinking and discussing about that, it already creates some tension, right? So there you have a rivalry, which we have seen in the past when things like this have been debated. And sometimes you could even reach the conclusion that we already have a highly visible metropolitan government in the largest and broadest sense, which is the Catalan government. You could even sustain that if you wished, in the sense that if the population of the metropolitan area is like 70% of the global population of the country, Catalonia, and if you have another reality, which is that almost 80% of the economy is concentrated in this large regional Barcelona, then you got it. You have already a metropolitan government which also encompasses other areas, but which basically has to focus on the metropolitan reality. The other drawback or the other criticism to larger visibility is that it's easier to get down to work if you're not so visible. If the press is not on top of you, if there's no visible political tension, if there's no election campaigns related to the metropolitan area and the metropolitan government, it's easier to reach consensus. It's easier to manage things like transportation, like water supply, like waste management, etc., which are the main powers which the metropolitan area of Barcelona has. So it's very much a managing body which willingly does not enter into political tension. And that makes it much easier, in a sense, right? And we are much freer in the Metropolitan Council or in the Metropolitan Government to take decisions on purely technical reasons. It's much easier to do that. So it does have its advantages. Now, disadvantages, they also exist. Possibly the main one is that most people don't even know you exist. And when you're trying to explain that it's so important to have a metropolitan approach, that it's so important to coordinate things, that it's so important that people realize how metropolitan realities affect their daily lives, you have a very tough work to convince just normal people that what you're doing is relevant for their lives. So that's the main drawback. Of course, we could do something halfway through, which is saying, okay, we don't politicize the metropolitan government. We don't make it much more visible, but we try and simplify things, because our colleague here from Amsterdam, Udo, was saying about how they experience or they suffer in Amsterdam 5 different levels of representation and administration. Well, let me say you're lucky. We've got 8 here, because we have the district councils at a local level in Barcelona for neighborhoods, big neighborhoods. We have the municipalities, like Barcelona itself. We have the Metropolitan Council. We have the County Council, Consell Comarcal, which we'll get rid of one day, but it's still there. We have the Province Council. We have the Catalan government. There's the Spanish government, the state. There's the European Union. So imagine if somebody looks at us from Mars, he'll probably think we just turned crazy. We just want to complicate our lives so much. The fact is that why do these things kind of work? Despite this look at this reality from a distance, from Mars or from Brussels, it's probably very similar. But why does it work? It does. In fact, it's relatively efficient. It doesn't generate that many problems. Why? Well, probably it's because this mixture between visible and invisible administrations. There's administrations where you don't have direct representation, where people don't vote for the leaders, you don't have any campaigns, you don't have any high media or political tension. And that makes it possible to have secondary representation in the province or in the Metropolitan Council or in any other of these bodies we mentioned. And so you don't really have 8 different levels of representation. You have 8 different administrations. Half of those are highly political. The other half mostly concentrate in management. And it doesn't work that bad. And that's why we're not so much in a hurry to change things in the direction that the report that your report probably points out. If we did it, we know we would have major problems, and we would have huge discussions. So for the time being, we rather prefer to get down to work. Probably we'll have to simplify, obviously, at least some of these. 2 or 3 of these would have to go. But we're not really in a hurry. We think that we got to do it in a very reasonable, intelligent way, so that we don't create a reality which is even harder than the one we have. I don't know if I got the point through, but I think it works this way.
Yes, okay. Now we have the trouble of time, but you are not only listeners here. If any of you have any remarks to this starting debate about metropolitan level, then it is just time now to have an opinion or have a contribution from the floor. If not, then we go further. But yes, there was one here.
Well, my name is Mireia Velil, M-I-R-E-I-A, difficult one. I would like, I've got thousands of questions because you really made an interesting report and very interesting presentations. But I have one that is very specific to your first questions of the direct metropolitan mayor. What would be the rationale behind defending this direct election if there is no direct election of the city mayors and the neighborhood councillors? And then about the identities. If we are in a world of dynamic geographies, and we don't know those geographies where are they leading us, do you need really an identity, or do you need a narrative, as Mr. Harding said, a narrative that would defend the metropolitan reality as something better off for these citizens than the municipal spreading, for example? Thank you.
I have one concern, which is the relationship between supra-municipal organizations such as yours and the national or state governments. We've touched on the issue as far as Barcelona and Catalonia and Spain is concerned, but where does the power balance lie? Obviously, it's a delicate issue here. But where does it lie elsewhere, and what's the relationship like? And looking towards the future, we're tending towards city-states, perhaps. What do you think of that?
Hi, I'm Mariona Tomàs from the University of Barcelona. I want to ask to Professor Tosic about the question of being capital of the state and the model of metropolitan governance, because in this study you see that Amsterdam and Copenhagen don't have really a strong metropolitan government, and they are the capitals of the state, while in Manchester and Stuttgart in Barcelona you have some kind of institutional organization, while they are not the capital of the state. What do you think about this relationship? of course, we have then London and Paris, for instance, with institutional organization and capital of the state. But in this study, if you think it was a relevant question. Then I had another comment about the direct election of the mayors, especially for Professor Harding, that of course it gives more accountability and visibility, but what happens when in this direct election you have a low turnout? For instance, in Greater Manchester, it was 29% that people went to vote. So what do you think? Is real legitimate, this new metropolitan government with such a low turnout? And finally, I had a question for all the city, for all the metropolitan agglomerations about the question of fiscality, and not only how you collect the taxes or you have these sources of financing, but also about the redistribution among the municipalities. Is there a tax-based sharing in your metropolitan agglomeration? Do you have any kind of redistribution of these sources of financing among the municipalities so as to get some kind of metropolitan solidarity? Thank you.
So we are now after the first round of questions. I would come to the metropolitan narrative. I think it's a very interesting question. Alan, what do you think about that? Is it enough to have a metropolitan narrative if you don't have a leadership, if you don't have a mandate, if economic players are doing what they want? So is a narrative enough?
It certainly was for Greater Manchester for most of that 30-year period that I described. In fact, the narrative developed and got stronger during that 30-year period. I guess, so we have had experiments, to go to another one of the questions, in directly elected mayors for a lower level, for cities within England. I think the general consensus has been that because it was not associated with any increase in powers and resources, the effects of that change have not been particularly noticeable. But there is a debate about direct election as opposed to, leaders emerging from party systems and so on. The reason we've gone for something like a directly elected mayor at the metropolitan scale is just as a way of trying to, it's the lowest cost option for signifying a serious metropolitan political adventure, if you like. It may be over the long term we move to something like the Stuttgart model, with an assembly as well as a directly elected mayor. But to go back to the point about narrative, I just think the role that narrative has played in Greater Manchester is almost filling in for the absence of unified political leadership. So if it was only possible to get several different authorities to collaborate around a single set of aspirations, if they each believed in a narrative which united them and was not controversial for them. Had that not been the case, then Greater Manchester wouldn't have got to the point where it could take the step of having a directly elected mayor.
What about Amsterdam? I mean, do you have a narrative for Amsterdam? Amsterdam is fighting now for key economic positions in Europe. Amsterdam is fighting for some institutions coming out from Brexit-hidden UK. So can you really fight for that without having a stronger metropolitan identity?
Yeah, I think that's possible. I mean, Amsterdam has a very strong identity and a very clear narrative because of its history, because it's a very homogeneous city, because everybody knows what Amsterdam is about. It's about liberal attitude, strong economy, trade, openness. But that's not the identity of the region, because well, at some level, at some abstract level, that's the identity of the Netherlands, right? But the region, like I showed in my slide, it's so diverse. The metropolitan region, 33 municipalities, There's really, let me tell you, let me put it this way. I think a lot of the smaller municipalities and the people that live there, they derive their identity from opposing whatever is the identity of Amsterdam. I'm not sure if it really. Well, let me tell you a little story. 2 years ago, there was a small municipality, Haarlemmerliede and Spaarnwoude, 5,000 people. And the national government said you should merge with one of the other municipalities because it's no longer sustainable. And they had two options. One option was to merge with Amsterdam, or merge is not really the right word, because if you add 5,000 people to a city of 850,000, that's not a merger, that's a takeover, basically. But, and the other option was to merge with a smaller municipality, more rural municipality. And this small municipality, 5,000 people, was a rural area. From a rational point of view, it was a very easy decision. If they would merge with Amsterdam, they would keep all their services. We would only add the services of Amsterdam. Taxes were lower. They were afraid that we would build in their green areas. That would not happen because it would be illegal, because this entire municipality is in the building is restricted there because of the airport. So there was not one single rational reason not to merge with Amsterdam, honestly. And still, there was a vote, and I think it was 90 to 10. And they decided to go with the other municipality. That had to do with opposing, sort of making a statement about, Amsterdam, not wanting to belong to Amsterdam. They derived their identity in a way from opposing the Amsterdam identity. And I think at the end of the day, for regional cooperation, the way we have it organized in the Amsterdam metro area, it doesn't really matter. I mean, in an ideal world, if you would design regional cooperation in Amsterdam from scratch, we would do it different. We may pick the Manchester model or some other model. We would abolish the provinces and, I don't know, direct elections, maybe a mixed system. That's fine, but that's just not the way it is. And given the complexities, I think it works very well. It's very informal, the cooperation. There's not really a regional identity, but I don't think you really need it.
But there are also some other questions. If I know well, you have to build 250,000 new housing units in the next 1 or 2 decades. And this cannot be built in Amsterdam because Amsterdam is full. Amsterdam has a historic heritage. So where will you build it? And how can you cooperate with municipalities if they are rejecting you?
Well, what I'm saying is you don't need a strong joint identity, at least not in the Netherlands, to cooperate. So that's the point I wanted to make. How do you do that? Well, you're right. That's a very very difficult issue, right? Because the only policy area for which we in Amsterdam or in the region have a structure, a decision-making structure, is public transportation. We have a transportation region which has funding, which it gets from the state. It redistributes. It has the authority to make decisions, but that's only for transportation. All of the other policy issues, policy areas, including planning and housing, the cooperation has to be in an informal way across municipalities, across provinces. And the structure that we have for that is the MRA, the Metropolitan Region Amsterdam, which is a voluntary construct of the 33 municipalities and 2 or 3 provinces, including and the city of Amsterdam. And that's just a very slow and tedious process. There is a joint housing strategy now. Everybody realizes that it's not in the interest of Amsterdam to build all these houses in Amsterdam. It's not in the interest of the rural areas to build all the housing there. There are some joint policy objectives on which all of the municipalities agree, which is we're not going to turn our region into the greater San Francisco or Los Angeles area. We're not going to build everything. We're going to concentrate building in certain areas. But it's difficult. It's difficult, and you have to. That's the last point I wanted to make. A city such as Amsterdam, the political leaders there have to walk a very fine line. When you have such an informal cooperation, someone has to take the lead. Someone has to take the lead, and it is almost always Amsterdam. Because it's not like Manchester, where Manchester is equally sized to some of the other municipalities. Amsterdam is the biggest entity in our region, 850,000 people in a region of 1.5 million. So it's really, there's only one big city in this region, and that's Amsterdam. So someone has to take the lead, and it has to be Amsterdam. But you have to be very careful and very modest and really careful not to impose your policies, to impose your will on these other municipalities, because when you do that, and we did that, Amsterdam did that in the 60s and 70s. That's what you get. What you get then is this, like I just told the story about this municipality, 5,000 people. There was no rational reason not to merge with Amsterdam, and still they decided against it. That's because we were too dominant, too arrogant, in previous decades.
Okay, now Stuttgart has a very strong power. You have a metropolitan parliament. Can you say to one settlement that you are not allowed to build anything, and can you say to another one that you should build 1,000 flats here?
The tricky story is that we can really not allow development at the wrong place. We are very strong at restrictions. But what we do open and offer to municipalities is a window of opportunity. And what we are facing now, and that's our huge challenge, we just can make offers. We have strong brakes, but we have no accelerator to get stuff done on the local level. So zoning and development of land is still in the competence of the municipalities. So we are very strong to stop development on the wrong place, but we are weak, and we have no arguments just to tell, please do something if there is no development wanted on the local side. And that's quite a change of paradigm, because it was always supposed that municipalities want to grow at any cost. And that's how the system is built. You have a strong municipality that always is supposed to push development. And then you have on the regional level, you have those in charge who stop development at the wrong place. But if there is no one pushing on the local level, there is a lack of instruments on the regional level. And that's what we really see right now. We cannot provide enough residential areas. We have a growing demand for people coming to the region because we are about to send the baby boomers into retirement in the next 10, 15 years. We need to organize more housing areas, and we are not able to achieve this. And also we have a double demand of the industry. We have a growing industry right now, and we have an industry that is about to change, and we do not just have to provide logistic facilities, production facilities for that what we are building now, but we have also open spaces of opportunity for a changing transportation system, for building different types of cars and engines, and that's a huge challenge.
I like this expression, we have a strong brake but no accelerator. Is it in Barcelona as well? So do you have a possibility over the 36 municipalities you have? Can you say to one municipality that you should develop because we need your territory? And can you say to another one that please stop, don't?
No. No, you can't. But we're not really looking for that. It's much more like a cooperative administration between 36 municipalities. And there's a principle which is not written and it's not enshrined in law, but which works with Metropolitan Barcelona. And that's the principle that leadership is unquestionably on the side of the town of Barcelona, Barcelona municipality, and its mayor, who's also the president of the metropolitan area. So leadership there willingly is given over to Barcelona, which is a municipality of 1.6 million in a metropolitan area of 3.2 million. So it's like half the population. If we made it larger, it would change. But right now it's like that. So there's very clearly a role of leadership which is not questioned. And let me say that, and it's also unwritten, but it's there. One of the reasons it's not questioned is that it relates to what I think Monica was raising, the issue there, that there's also a redistribution of resources, which is also very willingly accepted, because Barcelona is financially more powerful, wealthier, we could say, can obtain more funds. So Barcelona is contributing more than its share, almost twice of what its share should be of expenditure, according to its population. So other municipalities, the immense majority of which have incomes, mean or average incomes, which are much lower than the average income in central Barcelona and the Barcelona municipality, they obviously accept that, because the metropolitan arrangement is also an arrangement for redistribution of resources. And that enables the metropolitan area to invest in towns out of these 36, which could probably not afford many of the investments which are made there on their own. So that really makes sense. In that regard, it's useful to have a metropolitan administration. It makes sense. And we are really helping people. And we are helping to improve the lives of people who are living in towns which could probably not deliver that improvement by themselves. So that's really what makes us think that it's a good idea to have a metropolitan administration. Now, if we speak about identity and strengthening metropolitan identity in abstract terms, then we get in trouble. We get in trouble regarding Catalonia, as I was saying before, and even we could create even like cultural divisions, which we don't want to create. Very clearly, we're not going to do that. And but also, you could enter in conflict, like Udo was saying again here, with local identities, which are also very strong. I mean, who in, let's say, in Sant Cugat, which is one of these 36 municipalities, wants to be considered as a Barcelonian full stop? That would really raise so much resistance that it's obviously not worth it. So we're not going to enter into that very risky and messy ground, because we think that would not improve the conditions of life of people living in the metropolitan area. It would actually create some conflict which would probably damage social cohesion and living together in this metropolitan area. Let me say there's another area where we think clearly we should work towards a stronger metropolitan authority. And that relates to competitiveness, international competitiveness. It's very clear that if you have a city of 4.5 million in international terms, or even in European terms, that's much more competitive than a city of 1.6 million. And if you work in the world at large as a big city of 4.5 million, you probably have more opportunities than if you work as a city of 1.6 million. And I think most of my colleagues would probably agree with that fact. So that's why it's so important not to be more visible, not to have like a stronger identity which might enter into conflict with the other realities, but that we become very competitive. That's also helping people and helping people's lives and improving their opportunities. How can we do that? Well, one of the things we decided to do 3 years ago was to strengthen the department and the area of international relations, cooperation, and aid. And we did it, and we're doing it, and we've been strengthening that through 3 years, working in collaboration and networking with other metropolitan areas in Europe. That's EMA, European Metropolitan Authorities. It's an association, and we go to see Corina Cretu, who's the Commissioner for Local Administration in Brussels, and we talk to her. And we say, look, Europe should take into consideration the needs of metropolitan areas. Because we represent, every day we represent a larger share of the population, but also because economic dynamism and change, and also social trouble is deepest and most important in metropolitan areas. So please think of Europe and take European decisions together with metropolitan areas. And we have to fight for that because we don't have it right now. It's not that easy to have European funding in metropolitan areas, whereas it's much easier to have it in regions or states. So we really have a battle, and we've got to do it together. We have to fight for that. And we have to be competitive in international and European terms. So there, yes, we have to strengthen metropolitan realities in that sense, for sure.
Okay, so we are now almost in an ideal picture that we have to fight for metropolitan identity, we have to go for win-win situations, we have to represent the region outside, but we have to keep the smaller settlements, we have to let them have their own identity, etc. Okay, but what happens if they are very poor settlements and very rich settlements in your metropolitan area? And the rich settlement says, sorry, I don't want social housing. Sorry, I don't want any intervention from your side. I don't want more development because I need my golf course, etc. So how can you create a metropolitan cooperation in social issues, in issues where you need more equality in your area? How can you do that if you don't want to intervene? Who has an answer on that?
I think that's a core issue. I think that's a core issue. That's a central issue. If you don't strike a deal on that, it won't work. It won't work. Even if you elect the president in direct elections, even if you have a very strong metropolitan government, even if you have lots of powers, if you don't strike a social deal and a deal for redistribution, I think this metropolitan body will not work. That's my impression.
And how did you achieve that in Barcelona? I mean, you said that Barcelona is generous, Barcelona contributes more than other settlements, so this is the basis why others also accept conditions and also work with you? Or?
Well, because that was in the origin of the creation of the Barcelona Metropolitan Authority. We got down to talk, we had 3 different bodies which took care of very specific issues, which was water supply, waste management and transportation, and they worked separately. Those already existed before 2007. But when we got down to work saying, look, let's tighten this, let's make it stronger, let's cooperate much more. We got those 3 entities, those 3 bodies together, and we decided to create a metropolitan government. But in the process, we realized that if we didn't make a deal in social redistribution terms, it wouldn't work. None of that would work because it hadn't worked with transportation. It had not worked. We had to find a solution where some of the municipalities, and most importantly Barcelona, were contributing more to public transportation than the others. And we saw that if we did that, the others would agree to give some margin for leadership to the city of Barcelona. So there you had a deal, and it was working in sectors, in specific sectors. So we brought it together for the creation of the metropolitan government as a whole.
Is it also the case in Germany? I have heard about a city, Frankfurt, where the rich people live outside the city itself is quite poor, and they cannot really achieve any deals with the surrounding area. So how did you do that?
Exactly. In Frankfurt is a good example. The German stock exchange moved just outside Frankfurt in a very rich, small town that uses all the benefits provided by the big city of Frankfurt for free. So, and a model couldn't work where you have the rich income taxpayers and the companies that pay a lot of tax just to the local level. And you leave the big cities that are in charge for all the infrastructure, for culture, for the lion's share of the transport system, if you leave them alone and without any support. So I think the gentleman in the second row mentioned the idea of city-states. We have some of these in Germany, like Hamburg and Berlin. And if you're talking about getting things done, like infrastructure or like affordable housing, the strong top-down coordination that is possible in a city-state gives them some advantage. And so we have examples in Hamburg that is really, so we are building a metro line with all the infrastructure, with all the housing and real estate that comes along with that, and have a large-scale development. That can be done on a city-state level. If you need to coordinate 5 or 6 or how many levels to get them all in line, it will take you more than 20 years. So there's a huge advantage if you have a city-state, but
you can achieve a kind of city-state situation if you equalize taxes, if you prescribe that in the metropolitan area the income tax should come to the metropolitan area level. How does it work in Amsterdam and in Manchester? I mean, do you have this kind of tax competition and tax differences and different interests?
There are almost no local taxes in the Netherlands. I think 80 or 90% of the taxes are levied at the national level. So actually the only tax at the local level is a real estate tax, and then there's small stuff. But so that's not an option. And then at the regional level, there's no tax. There's a very small contribution from each of the municipalities. It's 1.5 euros per person. So the budget of the metropolitan region, this construct that I just explained, I think it's 6 or 7 million euros, which is nothing. I think let me give an example of where it does work, this cooperation, and where Amsterdam took the lead, and it was not held against us. We are obviously seeking companies to establish themselves in the Netherlands post-Brexit. That is something where Amsterdam has taken the lead, but in a regional context. So we are cooperating with cities outside the metropolitan region, with Utrecht and Leiden, which have nothing to do with the region. They're 50, 60 kilometers. Utrecht is 50 kilometers out of Amsterdam, outside Amsterdam. Leiden 20 or 30 kilometers. They're not part of the region. And we are cooperating with those cities and with the national government to attract companies to, if they plan to leave Britain, to establish themselves in Amsterdam. And Amsterdam has provided most of the funding for that project, most of the resources. We've taken the lead. And honestly, and that's really an attitude, we honestly don't care if companies that want to leave Britain and establish themselves in the Netherlands, whether they establish themselves in Amsterdam or in Leiden. We honestly don't care. And that's also a bit of an attitude. If you say that and you repeat that, and the mayor says that, and I say it, and other politicians say it, then people, and they see that you put in the resources, then it becomes a credible thing. So that project, that acquisition project, post-Brexit acquisition project, that works really well. But in other areas, it's very difficult. The social housing, we're trying to cooperate, we're trying to come up with a strategic plan for housing in the region, but at the end of the day it's very difficult because in Amsterdam 60% of the housing is social housing. In most of the other municipalities in the metro area, it's much less, I don't know, 20-30%. And that's not going to converge. It's not going to converge. So
Yeah, this is the difference between the win-win things and things which people don't like. So to put a sewage plant somewhere, local government does not like it, etc. What is the case in Manchester? Can you really put everything everywhere where you want?
If only.
Directly
If
elected
only.
mayor now?
No, he's not that powerful. So on the finance point, we're much more similar to the Netherlands than we are to Spain or Germany. We're not a federal system, we're a highly centralised system. And most taxes are raised by national government rather than through municipalities. So the way in which the Greater Manchester institutions get their funding is largely from direct applications from national government, but it also has a proportion which is raised from local taxes. So there are two local taxes. There is a residential tax called council tax, and there is a business tax called the business rate. National government controls the level of those things, so there is not absolute freedom to raise taxes, even though they're small contributions to total budgets. So there is some redistribution going on because both of those things are nominally progressive, but you would face great difficulties in sort of tracing through the redistributive effects which come out of policy decisions which combine a big chunk of national resources with a small bit of local ones. The short answer to your question, Ivan, is that one of the big changes that Greater Manchester has managed to achieve through the new structures is that now, for the first time in 30 years, it is responsible for its own structure plan, its own strategic framework. That has raised all of the issues that colleagues have been talking about in terms of housing allocations, the balance between affordable housing, as we call it in the UK, social housing, and other housing stock, geography of residential settlements. It is the mayor's job to broker a set of agreements which will lead to basically what has to be a strategic framework for major land allocations, infrastructure over the next 30 years. But the plan in and of itself will not be the decision-making thing. It just simply has to try and put a context forward for the major infrastructure providers, housing providers, etc., to follow a logical plan. I'll come back in a couple of years' time if you still want me to make comments on this stuff. It's the strategic framework. This plan is a centrepiece of what's going to happen in Greater Manchester in the next 30 years. And at this present moment, we don't have a full set of agreements with all 10 authorities, if we're honest about it.
If Barcelona would like to have 3 wishes to be fulfilled, probably your first wish would not be a directly elected president, if I understand well. What would you like to have for Barcelona metropolitan area? What would you like to get really to become stronger?
Well, do you want 3 or
3?
3. No, there's one which is the main one, and possibly everything derives from that, which is delivering much better. We want to deliver. We want to make people's lives easier and better, not harder and more complicated. Okay? So I would say everything fits into that general principle. We think that it would be intelligent for improving people's lives to have a more competitive metropolitan authority in international terms. We really think so. We would get more international attention, more investments, and we would have a bigger say in the affairs of the world. That could benefit our own people. Another thing which we should try to obtain is much better social cohesion. I think we're on the road. We are going that way, but we should improve it. We should improve it in terms of housing, differently to the experiences some of my colleagues have explained. I mean, I think the sound is coming and going, isn't it? That's, sorry. Well, different to what my colleagues just explained, problems of housing in Barcelona and in the whole metropolitan area are related to a very low, an extremely low proportion of public housing. Something like 2% in the city of Barcelona, whereas the European average is about 15%. You talk about figures like 60% or 40%. That's just political fiction right here in our country right now. So we have to change that. Is the Metropolitan Authority a good tool to change that? I think so. We think so. Because we can get extra resources and decide where this public housing can go anywhere in the metropolitan area, which is anyway mostly connected by metro and fast local railways. So it doesn't really make a difference for people, and that's the main point. But it does make a difference if you have to take into account available ground, if real estate, if you must take into account financial capacity, and if you have both things together, and you can find available ground, and you can find funding, and you can do that through a metropolitan authority, then again it makes sense for improving people's lives. I told you the big principle, and then like 2 examples of that. Would that be good for your? Would that answer your question?
Yes. Yes. I turn to the audience. Do you have any other ideas, suggestions, comments? Because we were jumping quite between a few issues. So starting from election, going to financing. Also, we discussed the different roles and responsibilities and functions on metropolitan level. Do you have any remark, comment, suggestion? What we have heard here.
I would like them to answer his question. How much the state, the relations between states and metropolitan areas or the legal framework helps you in developing the importance of the metro area?
This is a question. How much the national state?
What is the relationship between the national state, the central state, and the metro areas? Is there a legal framework that helps you develop that or not? Because that is an important issue.
I think there are different examples here around the table. There are a few countries now in Europe, I would say, which have an urban policy, and within the urban policy they have a view about metropolitan areas. They are not too many. After the financial crisis, the state stepped back from this kind of policies. So France is probably the only one which still has a national urban policy, which has an agglomeration policy, but it is an extremely fragmented country. So UK, you abolished the regions, and then you said that now we have to build up something bottom up. So is it a good model, or?
Sorry, did you want to?
Yeah, I'd just like to make one comment. The word subsidiarity has not arisen at all. Okay. So where is that? No, it's concerning relationship with the state and with the European Union. Yeah. How does that play?
So if I start with the UK situation, we've got quite a complex geography, cultural geography in the UK. So I think probably all of us who've thought about the philosophical end of this question have thought here we are in Europe in a context where we've had nation states for 300, 400 years. They didn't exist before that. City-states did. Are we in transition to? I mean, I've got no philosophical answer to that question. I think it's really interesting. But actually you can see some forces within the UK which are beginning to fracture and fragment the national psyche, the national state. That's been led by cultural groups rather than economic groups. So Scotland is far ahead in terms of its claims for independence or claims for autonomy. The other non-English nations, that's what they are, Wales, Northern Ireland, are in the slipstreams of Scotland. We haven't typically thought very much about devolution within England, which is why this bottom-up experiment of Greater Manchester is so important, I think. We do have a model in London, but that's because the national state simply wants London to succeed as a global city and is absolutely determined it will be. They have no such interest in Greater Manchester. And, you know, whatever Greater Manchester is able to get from its relationship with the national state is based on all of the things we've been talking about. It's, you know, it's combining forces, it's arguing a case, it's presenting a narrative, presenting a united political front. In certain respects, you know, what we're trying to do is create the conditions for a future city-state, but we are a million miles away from getting there. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay.
And what about the Dutch government? Do they consider the problems of Amsterdam? Do they give you any help to really create a larger territory working together, not only through painful negotiations from one step to the other? Can the provinces agree with each other, because your metropolitan area is crossing the borders of provinces, which I think makes it very difficult?
That's a very tough question. I think the one thing that the Dutch government, and there's been quite a bit of consensus about that, has done in recent years, is to push for increasing the scale of municipalities. So we still have quite a lot of smaller municipalities in the Netherlands. There are 400 right now. There used to be 1,200. And 400 municipalities on 16 or 17 million people, that's a lot. I just gave the example of this municipality near Amsterdam that has 5,000 people. So that is a way of consolidating and trying to create some sort of regional cooperation and scaling up. I honestly don't know the answer to the technical question. Is there a legal framework for metropolitan cooperation in the Netherlands? I don't know. I don't think there is. Because the metropolitan, I explained what the metropolitan cooperation in Amsterdam looks like. It's very voluntary. But in Rotterdam and The Hague, it's much more structured, and there's actually they have much more power, that metropolitan entity, Rotterdam and The Hague. So I don't think the Dutch government or national state is very much focused on metropolitan areas in the Netherlands. Maybe it's also because, in a way, the Netherlands is a metropolitan area. I mean, it's a small country. It's the Randstad, which is the four big cities, Utrecht, The Hague, Rotterdam, and Amsterdam. I think that probably has 6 out of the 16 million people, would be my guess. Some people say the Randstad, that's like, you know, that's one city. It's like Greater New York, and then the green area in the middle, that's Central Park, a little bit bigger, but. And I think that's a fair point. That's a fair point. And it also, you know, technological developments and the increased quality of public transportation, it really changes things. 20 years ago, it would be, you would commute within the metropolitan area. That's it, right? Right now, there are quite a few people that live in Zwolle, which is 80 kilometers out there, 70, 80 kilometers to the east. When you're a big city guy like myself, Zwolle is really way out there, right? That's rural. That's people live there now, and they work in Amsterdam. They commute. That's because there's a high-speed train, and it takes you 50 minutes from Zwolle to Amsterdam. So Rotterdam, Amsterdam, I think that's 35 minutes, right, by train. 35. So to answer your question, I'm sure the national government is doing something for metropolitan areas. I'm sure they are, but I'm not aware of it, and I'm not even sure if it's really a problem. So.
Okay, I mean, Netherlands is a fantastic example for public transport, for very well managed national public transport. You can even use the same ticket in all the cities, etc., which is a unique example. So, is there a policy in Germany for metropolitan areas? Apart from the Metropolitregionen, which is much larger issue and much larger territories, but for real metropolitan areas.
But even for them, there is no policy that you can fix elsewhere. We have a strong focus on rural areas that has to do with the constitutions. We want to provide equal quality of living. That's the motto. And this can hardly be achieved. You know, we have far remote parts in the northeastern part, close to the Polish border, and we provide all the services, and we spend a lot of money for that. So we have a strong focus on keeping the remote places aboard. But we have no decided policy for the powerhouses, the places where the money is actually earned. And that's also, I think that's also true if you look at the European Union. We spend the huge lion's share of the budget for agriculture. And if you have a look at the maps, I've been invited some 2 years ago to a hearing and to Brussels. And if you look at the maps, and if you look at the NUTS 2 level, which is significant for making all the maps and provide all the analysis for the actual decision makers in Brussels, it's all mixed together. Stuttgart is blended together with the Black Forest. So what the outcome is pretty average. If you look at the map and you have Stuttgart and the Black Forest, it's okay, but you do not see that there is a metropolitan area. You just lose the focus. And I think that's what we have to achieve, that we bring metropolitan areas back to the map, and that we make visible what we are contributing to the well-being of the whole European Union.
And if I may ask Spain, I mean, does Spain have a policy about Madrid, Barcelona, Valencia, Bilbao, etc., about the real metropolitan areas, or is it not? Is it a non-issue?
Sorry, did you get me?
Yeah.
We should probably ask Spain about that. But regarding our reality here, we do, as you know, you're very much aware, we have our grievances. We do have them. And to the extent that there's a very strong movement in favor of independence. And now you might say, what does that have to do with the metropolitan reality of Barcelona? My opinion, and let me speak about my beliefs and my interpretation of reality, is that it's very strongly related. So this issue of confrontation between metropolitan areas and the state here has reached an extreme situation. When the whole pro-independence movement started like 7 years ago, it started as a protest movement with huge demonstrations against the lack of funding, the lack of attention, the position of the Spanish state regarding infrastructures, basically metropolitan infrastructures, the airport, the local railways, and others. So yes, there's a relationship. There's a very interesting book, which I recommend if you're interested in situations like this, which was written by Jane Jacobs back in the 70s, I think, not about Catalonia, unfortunately, but about the situation. It was called something like Montreal and the question of separatism in Quebec or something like that. And her thesis, which is extremely stimulating and helps us to understand what's happening to us, is that the pro-independence movement in Quebec doesn't spark out as a rural, traditionalist, closed down kind of discourse. It's basically, what she says, is that it's basically metropolitan, and it has to do with Montreal. And it's when the elites and like the middle classes in Montreal and business people realize that they're getting beaten by Toronto, and that Canada is favoring other urban and metropolitan realities, when they react to that. And then they start asking things which are very familiar to us, like a truly international airport hub, like a fair, commercial trade fair, which is really international, and with Canada backing it and the state backing it, so that it's really competitive. And things which I got the feeling that if you substituted Montreal for Barcelona, Quebec for Catalonia, Canada for Spain, and Toronto for Madrid, despite the huge differences, that book would still work here. So, because there's this major grievance, which I think almost everybody shares here in metropolitan Barcelona, that we're not getting attention, that the Spanish state is not playing for Barcelona, but against it, and that it's playing for other realities like Madrid, for instance, which is the capital. That grievance exists, and I think that we could probably share that grievance with many people who are even against Catalan independence. But obviously that reality, that collective and mental psychological reality, is helping many people to think that maybe we should just break loose. So I didn't want to be very political about this, but I really do think it has an importance. And I think it is rooted also in many things, but also in metropolitan grievances. I think that's really the case, so that's why I mentioned it.
I think we came to more or less to the end of this discussion, but I have the feeling that our message to the national governments is that metropolitan areas would need more attention, would need more helping framework, would need more possibilities to allow for their development and remove the barriers what they have, and then probably the situation would be better. And this could be a message also to be delivered to the European level to push the national governments that they should go into this direction. So thank you very much for your attention, and thank you for the panel for the discussion, and I think we had quite interesting examples and debate. Thank you.
Thank you.